Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
The thing about family gatherings, especially the ones that happen under the disguise of celebration, is that they rarely feel like celebrations to the people being celebrated. I knew walking into that overpriced suburban bistro that this brunch wasn't about me turning 43. It was about optics. It was about Dad getting to do his annual family photo with the fireplace in the background, even though it was July. And it was about Julie pretending she didn't resent the hell out of me while calling me her free-spirited sister. I pulled up 5 minutes late on purpose, and of course, they were all already seated. My dad had probably insisted on that, because God forbid anyone wait for Rachel. My sister had her arms crossed in that way she always did when she wanted people to think she was relaxed, but couldn't actually unclench. My nieces were glued to their phones under the table, probably Snapchatting each other about how long they'd be stuck with their boring aunt. I walked in, wearing the only dress I owned that I actually liked, forest green, with little silver buttons down the side. I knew it made me look a little overdressed, but I didn't care. I wanted to look like someone. Maybe not someone they approved of, but someone they'd remember. My dad didn't stand when I arrived. He looked up, gave me a nod like a waiter dropping off bread, and went back to his orange juice. Julie stood and kissed my cheek like we were playing house, and she smelled like money and lemon shampoo. Her husband, Greg, the kind of man who got his master's in mediocrity, offered a half-hearted "hey there" without removing his sunglasses. It was cloudy. I sat, smiled, and let it begin. The brunch was exactly what I expected. Pancakes that tasted like cardboard, small talk that felt like barbed wire, and my dad making passive jabs so smooth you'd miss them if you weren't used to them. I was used to them. At one point he asked me if I still worked with old people, referring to the hospice volunteering I used to do, which I hadn't done in over 4 years. I told him no, I work freelance now, and his eyes lit up the way eyes do when they spot weakness. "Oh," he said, dragging it out like a rubber band about to snap. "So, still not a real job then?" Julie giggled and quickly sipped her mimosa like that would erase the sound. Greg cleared his throat and stared at the menu, even though we'd already ordered. My father grinned in that way he does when he's just said something he knows will sting but thinks he's too old to be called out for it. I could have said something right then. I could have reminded them of the countless nights I spent feeding Mom through a straw when her stroke took her dignity. I could have mentioned how many credit card payments I made behind their backs when the house was one missed check away from foreclosure. But I didn't, because this wasn't the moment. Not yet. Instead, I smiled and took a bite of my eggs. Cold. Runny. Perfect metaphor. Then came the toast. It's a Whitman tradition that at every birthday, someone stands and gives a toast, usually filled with inside jokes, fake affection, and that nauseating, "we're just so lucky to be family" energy. And of course, Dad stood up. Julie clapped lightly like a backup singer. The waitress paused behind him, visibly confused. Well, Dad started, tapping his fork against his glass. 43. Not quite 50, not quite 30. Pause. Chuckle. "Rachel, we love you. Even if we don't always understand your choices." Another pause. Julie laughed too loudly. "Life is about building something, you know? A home, a family, a legacy. But I suppose not everyone's on the same timeline. Some folks take the scenic route." The whole table chuckled uncomfortably. I kept chewing. My stomach burned, not from the food, but from the white-hot anger I was swallowing with every bite. "And yet," he added, raising his glass higher, "here you are. Still managing to have brunch with us every year. Must be nice," he grinned. "To live a life of nothing and still make it to the table." Cheers. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the waitress stopped moving. My heart was pounding so loud I thought the table might shake. I looked up slowly, made eye contact with every single one of them, and then I smiled. A real smile. Not sarcastic. Not angry. Just calm. I lifted my own glass and said, "To nothing." And then I drank. We wrapped up shortly after. No cake, too many carbs, Julie said. No gifts, we thought the brunch was enough. I didn't mind. I didn't want things. I wanted a different kind of closure. One I hadn't allowed myself to plan for until that very moment. I hugged everyone goodbye like I meant it, even Dad. I whispered thank you into his shoulder. He probably thought it was for the meal. It wasn't. In the parking lot, I stood for a second, letting the sun hit my face. Then I opened the car, sat down, and closed the door softly behind me. For a moment, I just breathed. No music, no phone, just the dull ache of a decision settling in my chest. Then I whispered to no one in particular, okay then. Let's see what nothing looks like. And I turned the key. The house was never really mine, not in the way people claim ownership over something with pride or permanence, but more like a holding pen for obligations that stretched on longer than I ever anticipated. It had once belonged to my parents, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, white siding, brown roof, and windows that always fogged up on the inside during winter. I moved in after my brother's accident, just until things settled down, which of course they never did. Temporary became permanent, like it always does when you don't push back hard enough. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the faded couch that still had a coffee stain from the night Julie cried over her divorce papers and spilled Cabernet all over the armrest. I never cleaned it properly. Maybe I didn't want to. Maybe I needed a reminder of just how much of the space and my life had been shaped around other people's disasters. The closet door in the hallway groaned when I opened it, like it was warning me not to go back into the past, but I ignored it. I pulled out 3 boxes marked taxes, receipts, and medical, all labeled in my handwriting, all ignored for the better part of a decade. The air smelled like dust and responsibility, the kind that settles in layers and never really goes away. The checkbook was at the bottom of the second box, tucked between a pharmacy receipt for Mom's blood pressure meds and a pink envelope I recognized instantly, Tommy's last birthday card to me before the car flipped on Highway 40. He'd drawn a crooked smiley face on the back and written, "You're the good one." I ran my fingers across the ink, which had started to fade, then placed it on the coffee table beside me like it still had something left to say. I sat down and opened the checkbook, feeling the weight of years in my lap. Page after page was filled with tiny handwriting, bank logos, and steady, unremarkable amounts. 200 here, 350 there. 600 once in a while when the roof needed patching or Julie's car needed tires she couldn't afford after alimony took a chunk out of her paycheck. I wrote the checks, mailed the envelopes, and never asked for thanks. I just assumed someday someone would notice. They didn't. I reached for my calculator, the same cheap plastic one I'd had since college, and started adding up rent payments. 17 years of rent, at $300 a month. That's about $70,000, give or take. I said it out loud as I wrote it down, not even realizing the math was wrong. It's actually over $60,000, not $70, but my brain, worn down from years of mental arithmetic and emotional bookkeeping, didn't catch it. Not that it mattered. Nobody ever asked for receipts. That's the funny part about being the responsible one. Your work becomes invisible. Nobody throws parties for the person who keeps the lights on, who remembers the passwords, who buys the toilet paper and notices when the fridge is almost empty. I had turned being invisible into an art form. I didn't even know when I'd stopped expecting to be seen. The final check was blank. I stared at it for a long time before filling it out. The amount was large, more than I should be spending, more than what anyone would assume I had, but I knew it was exactly what was needed to pay off the last piece of my father's mortgage. I had called the bank 2 weeks earlier and got the exact number, down to the penny. The man on the phone sounded surprised when I told him I was paying it off all at once. "You must really love your parents," he said, with that tired little laugh people use when they don't know how else to respond to something uncomfortable. I didn't correct him. Let him think what he wanted. It wasn't about love. It was about ending something. A chapter, a role, maybe an entire version of myself that had been fed scraps for too long and kept pretending it was a meal. I signed my name, tore the check gently, and slipped it into an envelope. Then I folded a piece of paper, just one, no greeting card, no drawn-out explanations, and wrote the note in blocky, clear handwriting. This covers the last of your mortgage. Paid for with the nothing I did with my life. R. I sealed the envelope with a little bit of spit and maybe more venom than necessary. My hands shook slightly, not from fear or regret, but from something else, something like power. For the first time in years, I felt like I was holding the pen in my own story instead of scribbling footnotes in someone else's margins. I put the envelope on the counter by the fruit bowl, the same one Mom used to fill with wax apples, and stood back to look at it. It looked so small, so innocent, like it wouldn't blow a hole through a man's ego big enough to swallow everything he thought he knew. I didn't feel sad. I didn't cry. There was no swelling of music, no monologue, no cinematic goodbye. Just quiet. And the satisfying click of the checkbook snapping shut one last time. The closet door creaked closed behind me as I turned off the hall light. I looked back one last time and said nothing. Because what was left to say? They were never going to thank me. And now, they wouldn't have to. The knock came early enough to catch me in the middle of folding the same sweater for the third time, and for a second, I thought maybe it was the neighbor coming to ask if I was moving, but then I heard her voice, bright, chirpy. Just a little too loud for the quiet of a Tuesday morning, and I knew it was Julie before I even reached the door. She had a way of announcing herself through sheer energy, like a performer stepping onto a stage no one asked her to be on. I opened the door slowly, already bracing for whatever version of her had decided to show up today, and there she was, standing in her usual uniform of slim jeans, loose cashmere cardigan, and that damn perfect ponytail that somehow made her look 5 years younger than me even though she's older by 2. She stepped in without waiting for an invitation, scanning the room like she was assessing damage after a storm. "So," she said, eyes landing on the packed boxes stacked neatly by the window, "you're really doing it, huh?" She smiled, but not in a way that reached her eyes. More like someone offering condolences for a pet you didn't even know was sick. "Yep," I replied, not bothering to ask how she knew. News traveled quickly in our family, especially when Dad was involved. If you ever wanted everyone to know your business, all you had to do was disappoint him once. She wandered into the living room, brushing her fingers across a photo frame I hadn't packed yet, one of me, her, and Tommy at the beach, back before everything cracked open. She picked it up, held it for a second, then set it back down like it might burn her if she stared too long. "I just wanted to stop by," she said, sitting on the edge of the couch like someone playing guest in a stranger's house, "see if you needed help with anything. You know, before you go do your thing." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Julie never offered help unless she had something to prove. That's always been her way, wrapping judgment in the glittery foil of concern. She looked around again, taking in the bareness of the room, and then landed her gaze on me like a spotlight. "You'll find your path eventually, Ratch," she said, voice soft, tilting her head the way people do when they want to seem empathetic but are really just being condescending. "I know things didn't turn out the way you expected." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so deeply, hilariously wrong. I didn't expect anything. I chose this. I chose sacrifice over spotlight, chose to hold the net underneath the tightrope they all walked across, even when no one looked down to see who was catching them. Instead of arguing, I walked into the kitchen and pulled out the bottle of wine I'd been saving since Mrs. Alvarez passed. She'd left it to me with a handwritten note that just said, "For the day you let go." I figured today it was close enough. "Wine?" I asked, holding it up. Julie hesitated for a moment, probably calculating the calories, but then nodded with that tight-lipped smile she reserved for when she wanted to seem cool or down to earth. We sat on the couch, our glasses full, and for a moment it almost felt like sisters. Until she spoke again. "You know, Greg always says you're brave," she offered, swirling the glass in her hand like she was on some morning talk show. "To live the way you do, without a plan, just floating. It must be freeing, not having anything to tie you down. I could feel the words digging in, each one dipped in sugar, but sharp enough to scratch. No plan. Nothing to tie me down. Just floating. God, she really thought that was how I lived, like a balloon someone forgot to tether. I took a long sip of wine, let it settle, then smiled. To strong women, I said, raising my glass just a little higher, who lift each other up. She clinked hers against mine, not realizing the toast was a blade wrapped in velvet. After she left, with a flurry of air kisses and the promise to text soon, I locked the door behind her and exhaled the breath I'd been holding since she arrived. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a stage that had just emptied after the final act, the audience long gone, the props left scattered. I walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and clicked on the file I had saved 2 days ago. The audio crackled for a second, and then my father's voice filled the room. Must be nice to live a life of nothing. I let it play all the way through, every pause, every fake laugh, every silence too loud to ignore. I didn't flinch. I just listened. Because next time someone said I was floating, I wanted to remember exactly what it cost me to stay grounded. The road back to my father's house felt longer than it ever had before, though I'd driven it hundreds of times, probably more times than either of my parents ever realized. Every bump in the road, every flicker of sunlight between the trees on that narrow stretch of old pavement felt like a memory trying to climb back into my chest, a ghost of an obligation, or maybe just guilt dressed in familiar scenery. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other pressed lightly against the envelope resting on the passenger seat, the weight of it small but unmistakable, like a sealed verdict no one was expecting. It wasn't fear I felt, not anymore. That part of me had been drained dry over the years, first when Mom got sick, then when Tommy didn't come home. Then again, every time I sat at a family dinner pretending not to care that I was the only one who hadn't received so much as a thank you for holding the entire damn circus together. What I felt now was closer to resolve, the heavy kind that doesn't shake or blink when someone tries to poke holes in it. Dad was out front, exactly where I expected him to be, standing in the middle of the lawn with the same damn green plastic watering can he'd used for years, tilted awkwardly over a patch of wilted roses. His back was turned to me when I pulled into the driveway, but I saw his spine stiffen slightly, like he knew it was me before I even shut the engine off. I stepped out slowly, envelope in hand, not bothering to call out or wave. He didn't turn. I walked up behind him and waited until he finally looked over his shoulder, eyes squinting under the harsh midday sun, mouth a thin, unreadable line. For a second, neither of us said a word. I held out the envelope like a peace offering, though I knew damn well it was anything but. He looked at it, then at me, eyebrows tightening just slightly. "What's this?" he asked, still not reaching for it. "I'm done, Dad," I said, my voice calm, even almost too quiet. "Don't worry, I left you covered. For once, I get to leave." He blinked, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something behind his eyes, confusion, maybe suspicion, but not yet understanding. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I placed the envelope on the small brick ledge beside the front steps and turned without ceremony, walking back toward my car like the last 20 years had never happened. He didn't stop me, didn't ask where I was going or why. He just stood there, water still trickling uselessly from the spout of that old can, soaking the dirt like he was trying to fix something that had already rotted from the inside out. I started the engine, didn't look back until I hit the end of the street, and even then I only glanced in the rearview mirror long enough to see him bending slightly at the waist, reaching down to pick up the envelope like it might explode. The image stuck with me longer than I expected, my father, hunched, cautious, almost small in the face of something he couldn't yet define. He opened it as I turned the corner and disappeared. Inside the envelope was the check, crisp and thick, the ink still smelling faintly of permanence. It covered the exact remaining balance of the house, the one he'd always insisted was his alone, The one he told everyone he'd built with hard work and discipline and bootstraps none of us were allowed to question. And next to it was the note, folded neatly, nothing fancy, nothing poetic. Just the truth written plain as day. This check covers the last of your mortgage. Paid for with the nothing I did with my life. R. I imagined the way his hands must have trembled reading it, not from weakness or age, but from the weight of what it really meant, that every belittling comment, every passive dismissal, every toast delivered with that smug smirk had been a paper wall trying to block out a reality he refused to see. That the daughter he dismissed as directionless had been carrying him on her back the entire time, without fanfare, without applause, and now, without explanation. I kept driving, letting the road unfold ahead of me like a breath I'd been holding for too long. There was no destination yet, just motion, just distance. Somewhere between the town limits and the county line, I laughed, not loud, not bitter, just a single breath of disbelief. All those years of doing the right thing in silence, and all it took to shift the axis was a piece of paper and the right words. He would read that note again. Maybe more than once. Maybe he'd think about all the times he'd told me to grow up, to get serious, to stop pretending I had time to find myself. Maybe he'd even sit down in that worn recliner by the window and realize how wrong he'd been, or maybe not. Maybe he'd find a way to twist it into a compliment to himself, some kind of proof that his criticism had motivated me into doing something useful. I didn't care anymore. He could mutter his questions into the silence of that empty house all he wanted. I'd already said everything I needed to, and I'd said it in the only language he truly understood, dollars and debt. And I knew, as sure as the sun was burning through the clouds overhead, that the first thing out of his mouth wouldn't be thanks or even an apology. It would be something like what I imagined, something halfway between accusation and plea, as he stared at that note and muttered to himself, "Is this your way of saying goodbye?" But regret sounds different coming from a man who never thought he'd feel it. The apartment wasn't much, not in the way people talk about new beginnings like they're supposed to sparkle with promise and light, but it had windows that opened without sticking and floors that creaked just enough to feel real, like a place that remembered what it meant to be lived in. It smelled faintly of salt water and old wood, and from the small, splintering balcony you could just barely make out the line of the ocean if you leaned far enough past the railing. I didn't need more than that. I didn't want more than that. I hadn't unpacked everything yet. A few boxes sat untouched in the corner of the living room, their labels curling at the edges, their contents unimportant now. Most of what I owned had already been given away, sold, or left behind in rooms that no longer needed me, in houses that only remembered me when something broke or someone cried. This place didn't know my name, and that was exactly why I chose it. I made myself a glass of wine, cheap, warm, poured into a chipped mug because I hadn't found the glasses yet, and sat near the window as the sky turned soft with evening. There were no voices, no footsteps from upstairs, no family gathering just beyond the walls, only the distant hush of waves and the kind of silence that didn't demand anything from me. Meanwhile, back at the house I had quietly financed and slowly escaped from, my father stood in the center of what used to be my room, now stripped and echoing. He didn't know what to look for, or maybe he wasn't sure what he wanted to find. But curiosity has a way of hunting the guilty, and somewhere between shifting old shoeboxes and pushing aside a dusty stack of National Geographic magazines I kept for no real reason, he found the folder. It was unmarked, not hidden, just tucked in the back of the closet the way you leave things you're not ready to throw away but can't bear to see every day. He pulled it out slowly, like it might snap if touched too hard, and sat down on the edge of the bed, which was no longer mine. Inside were pages, stacks of them, some clipped, some folded, most yellowed at the edges. Hospital bills with my name on them as the payer. Pharmacy invoices dated during the months Mom couldn't walk. Rent receipts from Julie's first apartment after the divorce, when she told everyone she'd managed it on her own. Airline ticket stubs for red-eye flights I never told anyone I took, to pick up Dad after one of his mysterious work trips that ended with him passed out at baggage claim and reeking of gin. There were letters, too, some from banks, some from nonprofits, one from a woman named Cynthia at St. Luke's Hospice Center, thanking me for my discreet generosity in covering a stranger's care when no one else would. At the very back was a photograph, one of the few I'd kept printed, Tommy, sunburned and grinning, 15 years old, wearing that awful orange hoodie he refused to take off for an entire year. On the back, in my messy, impatient handwriting, a note barely legible now: "You promised you'd take care of them." I did. I don't know how long he stared at that picture. Maybe minutes. Maybe hours. Maybe time got lost the way it always does when you're finally seeing something that was in front of you all along. I didn't cry when I packed that folder. I didn't write it for him. I didn't think he'd ever find it. But part of me hoped, somewhere, deep in the bone of who I am, that he might one day want to understand what it had cost me to live a life he dismissed as nothing. Back in the apartment, the sun dipped low enough to wash the walls in gold. I kicked my feet up onto the coffee table, took another sip from the mug, and let the silence sit next to me like an old friend. There was no music, no celebrations, no one arriving to toast my freedom with overpriced wine and sentimental speeches. It was just me, the ocean, and the stubborn quiet I had earned. They all got their stories, my sister with her perfect little family and curated Instagram memories, my father with his myth of hard-earned success and righteous sacrifice. Even Tommy, gone too young, still lived in a better light than I'd ever been granted. They all got their stories. I just never told mine. Until now. The voicemail icon blinked on my phone like a heartbeat I didn't ask for. I stared at it for a long time before pressing play. There was a pause on the other end, long enough I almost thought it was blank, and then his voice came through, quieter than I remembered it, like the sound had been scraped raw before reaching me. "Is this your way of saying I was wrong?" That was it. No name. No apology. No, "I'm sorry," or "thank you," or "you didn't have to." Just a question, dressed in pride and confusion, and something that might have been regret if you squinted hard enough. I didn't flinch. Didn't pause. Didn't save the message to some emotional vault where daughters keep the crumbs their fathers toss at the end of a lifetime. I deleted it. Not out of anger. Not even out of spite. I deleted it because I didn't need it. Because this ending didn't require his permission. Because I finally understood that silence could be the loudest answer of all. Then I leaned back, eyes on the darkening sky, and let the sound of waves fill the room.